Hello everyone and welcome to our latest bite-sized data protection session for schools. Today we're going to be talking about how to do DPIAs, data protection impact assessments, particularly for those AI-based tools or products that you may more and more be looking to use in your school or multi-academy trust.
Thanks, Adam. So what we're looking at in this session, we're going to be looking at what is a DPIA, why do we need to do DPIAs, when we might need to do a DPIA, who should do them, and how to do them, and particularly when AI is involved. We're going to have a little example that we're going to go through. So what is a data protection impact assessment, or DPIA for short? So it's an assessment of the data protection and privacy risk to individuals posed by the school's handling of their personal data. So therefore, DPIA is in essence a risk assessment.
But why do we actually need to do DPIAs? Well, the most obvious answer is it is in many circumstances simply a legal requirement to do them. It's there in the GDPR. Talks about the requirement to do a DPIA in certain circumstances, which we'll come to in a moment. But there are benefits to doing DPIAs, it's fair to say, that go beyond just the simple requirement that we have to do them. It actually helps us manage risk, and it helps us demonstrate our accountability. Now, that's a key phrase because accountability is something that's threaded through the UK GDPR. And the law says not only do we have to do A, B, C, X, Y, Z on data protection, it also says actually we need to demonstrate how we've done it and the decisions we've come to. So it helps us demonstrate our accountability. When and in what sorts of circumstances might we need to do a DPIA? Well, what the law and what the ICO guidance says is we have to do a DPIA when processing is likely to result in a high risk to individuals, or a high risk to those individuals' rights of freedom, or a high risk of some form of detriment to those individuals, putting it a different way. But again, in any event, it is good practice, regardless of severity of risk level, because actually it's going to help us again demonstrate that accountability, but it would also help us demonstrate we have a lawful basis to do what we're doing, that what we're doing is fundamentally fair, and it will help us ensure transparency in respect of those individuals whose data we're actually handling. So more specifically, when are we likely to need to do a DPIA? Because I would appreciate that general when the risk is high phrase, well, that only helps us so far, doesn't it? Let's think about what that actually might translate into. Well, one example of where risk may be higher and therefore where we are more likely to need to do a DPIA, as you can see here, it's when we're processing multiple categories or types of pupil personal data, or of anyone's personal data. So for example, we're probably less likely to need to do a DPIA where something only involves email addresses, but more likely to need to do it where it involves email address, name, school, what class someone's in, details of any special educational needs and disability. You can see in those circumstances, much more likely we're going to need to do a DPIA because risk is going to be inherently higher. Very much related to that, what about when we're processing those generally more sensitive categories of personal data, known as special category data? Again, that's going to mean that risk is higher, DPIA more likely on the cards. Think about it from the data subject's perspective too. How are they likely to react to a given initiative or a given particular piece of data processing we're undertaking? And the more likely they are to object to it, if you put yourselves in their shoes, you can almost guarantee we're more likely to be needing to do a DPIA and formally risk assess that and show that we've considered it. A few other examples down here, and we're going to skip to this last one because that's the main topic of our session today. We are certainly, almost certainly, if not absolutely, going to need to be doing a DPIA, I can tell you, whenever AI is being used to process personal data. That's what the ICO say they expect. So a few specific examples then of when a DPIA may be needed or would more likely be needed. Well, Something like if you're changing your MIS, your management information system, think of all those categories of data, including sensitive data, and not only the types of data, but the sheer volume of personal data that you've got in your school management information system. If you're undertaking a project to change that MIS to maybe a different provider, that's going to be a lot of data transfer. There's going to be some real risks involved there. DPIA is going to be pretty much a necessity. Use of a new platform to process staff on performance and absence. So an HR platform. Think again of the sensitivity of those types of personal data we're looking at on such a platform. If you're going to be doing that, let's make sure we've got a DPIA in place and you're taking that advice from us as your DPO. Cashless catering systems, specifically when they're involving, or particularly I should say, when they're involving the processing of biometric data, as is more and more the case these days. Signing your primary school up to an app to share photos and details of activities with parents. And what about a secondary school example, where we're using maybe an AI-based GCSE revision platform to be used by students? But also, what about research and universities? Many examples we come across where schools and universities want to work together in various initiatives and projects that will involve sharing sometimes quite sensitive categories of personal data about not only students, but sometimes parents and carers with that institution. What's our lawful basis for doing that? What would those people think about that? Would they object? More likely to need to do a DPIA in such circumstances. But not every single piece of data processing we do will need a DPIA. I think it's important to say that, a DPIA will not always be needed. Some examples, the school workforce census. We have to do it. The relevant authorities tell us how to do it. They say you need to do it. So we've got to do it. It's no good us kind of risk assessing and deciding whether or not we're going to do it because we've got to do it. Another example, what if, which we hope we never would be, of course, in a situation where we needed to actually share health-related information about a student, maybe with paramedics, in the event on site you had a life-threatening asthma attack being suffered by a pupil. DPIA, you will be delighted to know, would not be proportional or required in that situation. And a bit of an exam example at the bottom there as well. If we are just sharing the minimum required data with the exam board, are we expecting to see a DPIA for that? No, very unlikely that that would be required. So before handing back over to Stacey for some of the next stages, really the key message to give on when you're deciding whether a DPIA is required or not is, if you're not sure, do talk to us. Seek advice from your DPO. We will have a chat through with you what we're expecting to see in terms of some of the processing, and we will work out from those conversations whether a DPIA is going to be needed by the school or by your multi-academy trust.
Thanks, Adam. So let's look about who does the DPIA. So what we would say is the school drafts the DPIA and seek advice from us as DPO where required. We would then advise on that DPIA. So is there missing information? Do we need to go to the supplier to seek more confirmation around the AI elements of the processing? Then the school will act on that advice and make necessary amendments to that DPIA. And then finally, a senior school member of staff will need to sign off that DPIA, and they will confirm whether they accept or reject the DPO's advice on that DPIA. So how to draft a DPIA, particularly when AI is involved. So we're going to look at an example at the moment. So it's going to be an AI-powered revision app, and that could be applicable to both primary and secondary schools. So what steps are we going to look at for a DPIA? So why do we need a DPIA in this particular instance? Describe what processing will actually take place. Do we need to consult? So how do we consult and who do we consult? We need to assess the necessity and the proportionality of the processing. And then really important, identify and assess risk and see what measures we can put in place to mitigate that risk. And then finally, the sign off and recording of outcomes of the DPIA. So looking at step 1, so confirm why a DPA is needed for the project or initiative. So in this example, we would be saying a DPIA is needed because the school will be using AI to process student and staff personal data. And then we would also confirm that we need to mitigate the risks that AI-based processing presents to individuals' rights and freedoms. And then we need to balance that against the benefits we believe will be derived from the processing. So just describing the processing in step 2. So we'll need to identify which categories of personal data will be processed. So that could be names, that could be email addresses. It could also be special category data. So we may be putting send information or pupil premium, for example. Whose personal data are we going to be processing? Is it going to be students? Is it going to be staff members? Is it going to be both? Where is the source of that data coming from? You know, are we going to sync it directly with our MIS system, or are we going to be manually inputting that data? We need to look how the data will be processed. So how will the AI work? Expectation of data subjects as well. You know, what's their expectation on this kind of processing? And what is the school or trust aiming to achieve by using this AI product? So just some examples that we're going to go through. So describing the processing. So as I said, you know, what kind of personal data are we going to be processing? So for example, students' full names, school email addresses, their year group. And then if there's going to be free text answers to open-ended revision questions, that will be processed as well. And are we going to include staff full names and school email addresses so they can log into that app? So how will the data be transferred? So we will put down that it'll be synced from the app to from our MIS. So specify which API you'll be using to do that. And then in respect to any student free text, you know, when are the students going to be updating that? Is that going to be directly into the app? So then also looking at, you know, how will be accessed? So students being set up with login details, free text answers will be processed by the AI-based algorithm. And then that will provide tailored feedback to each student. And the answers and feedback can then be accessed by the designated member of school staff. And then finally, expectations. You know, what is the expectations of students? Also staff and parents and carers as well. They expect revision support to be in place. And it's also probably expected that it's tailored to each student's needs as well. And then just, you know, the use of AI-based revision apps are becoming more established in schools. And obviously we're doing that assessment to consider it a safe, effective and proportionate tool to support students.
Thanks, Stacey. So step 3, once we've done all of that and actually got down what's going on here with this particular processing, what about consulting with our stakeholders? So some examples we've given here, you see we've talked about consultation with subject teachers, but also consultation with parents and students as well. So how are we informing our parents and carers, particularly when we're looking at AI? We can't just go down a route of saying, oh, we'll just do it, go ahead and do it. And if someone asks later, then we'll give them the information. Really, particularly with something like AI, we do need to be saying to everyone involved, look, here's what we're planning to do. Here's why. Here's what we think the benefits will be. Let us know any ideas, thoughts, concerns you have. And that's the correct way of approaching it with our parent and carer community. What we're not saying is that we require the blessing or consent necessarily of individuals to go ahead with processing in the way that we believe is correct. But absolutely, we need to be transparent, don't we? We need to let people know what's happening, why we're doing it, and give them an opportunity to object and to let us know any questions or concerns they have. And record the outcomes of that here. As you can see in the example we've given here, we've said parents generally supportive of action taken, but some concern about a lack of teacher oversight. This is obviously a made-up example, but it is an example of something you could, generally speaking, potentially get back from your parents. So that's the kind of thing we're recording in the consultation section. And back to Stacey for step 4.
Thanks, Adam. So looking at step 4 now, we're assessing necessity and proportionality. So we're looking at what lawful basis we're relying on for this processing in the UK GDPR. We're looking at, is the processing necessary to achieve the school's aims? And also, could the aim still be achieved as successfully, but without the use of AI in this particular example? So just a quick reminder of the lawful basis contained in the UK GDPR. So we have consent of the data subjects, we have a contract in place, we have a legal obligation, we have vital interest. So the example Adam spoke about earlier about providing paramedics health-related data for a life-threatening event. We have public task. We also have legitimate interests. And then from the Data Use and Access Act, we've got recognised legitimate interests as well now. So what we will likely be using as a school or trust would be public task. And then just looking for some examples for your DPIAs. Obviously, we'll set out that we're relying on public task as our lawful basis. And the explanation would be this processing aligns with our statutory obligations as a school, so i.e. promoting the academic attainment of students through revision support. Just looking at the necessity, and the minimum data required to administer accounts for the students and staff on the revision app going to be shared. And also, why is that? So that data will be needed to ensure teachers can identify the students and also access their answers and feedback, and also reviewing the AI generated content as well for that accuracy and suitability. And then just looking at proportionality, just some wording around, can it be, can that processing be done in another way without the AI? So some of the examples would be that despite high quality of teaching, providing this tailored support for revision and test preparation has become more difficult just due to demands on staff time, and that the AI supported solution can help deliver that to the benefit of the students and teachers. So then what does the DFE have to say on the use of AI in education? Very straightforward. They say the intended use should be specified and have clear benefits that outweigh the risks. And that's what your DPIA will look at and assess.
Thanks, Stacey. So after all that, really, what does it come down to with the DPIA? Well, it comes down to these next sections we're going to go through now, steps 5 and step 6. They are really the core, the beating heart of the DPIA. They're what it's all about. They're what we're going to, really be judged on, potentially criticised on, worst case scenario, by regulators, by others, if we don't get right and if we can't show that we've done. It is, of course, the assessment of risk, particularly the assessment of risk to data subjects, and crucially, where we have identified and assessed that risk, what measures do we as the school or do the AI provider we're using have in place to actually manage that risk and mitigate it down to an acceptable level? Well, the first obvious question is, you talk about risk, Adam, but what risk? We don't know at this point. We're just generally saying that we're going to identify risk, but how do we work out what the risks might actually be? Well, what we have here is a number of examples of the kind of risk that you might be thinking about in terms of many types of data processing within your schools, but absolutely including this example of the AI-based revision app that we're going through here. So I won't go through them all, but you see them on your screen there. Technical security of the data, the risk that a system that we're using suffers some form of security breach. What about the risk of unauthorized access to that system, either within the school or by our data processor? The human error element too, particularly thinking about it from our perspective as the school. What if we need to, in order to set this particular AI to set this particular app up for our school, are required to transfer, perhaps manually, quite a lot of student personal data into that? How do we mitigate the risk of human error and transferring the wrong data? Plenty of other examples too, and a really important one here at the end is that reputational impact on ourselves, on the school multi-academy trust. We need to be considering that if things did go wrong, worst case scenario, and let's risk assess that in our DPIA. Yes, the core focus is on our data subjects, but let's think about potential worst case scenario impacts on us as the school or us as the multi-academy trust. So there's some general risks to be having a think about, but what about some of the more AI specific risks? And just pausing for a moment, what do you consider to be some AI based risks that you might come across when onboarding such apps, product systems into your school? Well, to put you out of your misery, here's a few things that we've already thought of that you will certainly need to be considering and assessing. And that one at the top left there is a really, really, really big one when it comes to personal data and AI. We always need to be questioning, whenever we're using such apps or products within our schools, is the personal data we put in going to be used to train those underlying models, those large language models used by the AI providers? What if we end up with inaccurate or unfair outcomes due to poor outputs or poor margins of error in the AI model? The quality, the accuracy of what it's actually producing for us. A couple of others referred to there, but you'll see towards the bottom we refer to these phrases allocative harms and representational harms, which collectively very much refer to the kind of risk that actually outputs are produced that might in fact discriminate against one group of people, or that may bias particular outputs or answers based on a particular characteristic, such as the race or ethnic origin of the individual, maybe even gender, other factors that may be at play. But it will always be a case-by-case basis. So the key things when looking to work out what kind of risks we do need to assess are, do use that information recorded in those initial stages of the DPIA. So as Stacey went through, where we described the processing, where we actually assessed how necessary and whether what we're doing is proportionate. But also, please talk to your DPO. Please talk to Stacey or me where you're struggling to work out, right, what might the risk be here? Worst case scenario, let's be negative. What could really go wrong? Do come and talk to us, particularly if you do find yourself having that mental block when you get to this part of the data protection impact assessment. So as we assess each risk, as I'm sure you will know from various other risk assessments that you will have undertaken in your role at the school, it's always about these two key things, isn't it? We're looking at the likelihood of a given risk happening, but considering not only that, but also how severe, crucially, the impact would be if the event did actually happen, and combining those two things. So what do we have here? Well, here we have just one example of what a kind of risk assessment matrix might look like. Now, if you do have a risk assessment matrix in your school or multi-academy trust, it may look something like this. Doesn't have to, but I do like this as an example because I think it quite nicely demonstrates that relationship, doesn't it, between likelihood and impact. So we can see that down here. And if we give an example of something that we think, well, do you know what? If this particular thing I'm worried about did happen, it would be pretty severe. So I'm going to say it's a 5, it's a major. But if that particular thing on balance is incredibly unlikely to happen, then we end up with 1 times 5, don't we? Very unlikely, even though the impact's major. And we end up somewhere in this part of the matrix. So even though if it did happen, it'd be quite detrimental, the fact that this particular, whatever it might be, given thing we're worried about is so unlikely to happen means that the overall risk is nice and low. I'm sure you're very much used to that from all sorts of other risk assessments for individual situations or for school trips maybe. Exactly the same thought process around likelihood of event and severity of event applies when you're doing your DPIAs, we can assure you. So what we've done here is given you a few, very few examples of risks and how that might look actually within the DPIA itself. So probably in your DPIA template, you'll have something like this, where you have a table where you can set out the risk, describe it, and then score it. actually have a bit of a think about. And this is again where to get back in touch with Stacey and me if you're not sure how high or how low the risk sits. And do talk to us so we can chat that through. But ultimately, we're of course multiplying that likelihood by that impact to give us the inherent score of the risk before we've considered what our actions might be to mitigate that risk. Then what about our mitigating measures, crucially? Well, what we've actually done here is we've split a few ideas about what some of your measures might be into two types. And this is particularly important when it comes to something like the use of AI. We've actually split our measures into some of those measures that might be considered by ourselves as the school, on the school side. But in a second, we'll come on to some measures that, best will in the world, we just don't know without consulting and checking with the company whose AI we're using. And so we're going to need to ask them for some information on the measures that they have in place to mitigate risk when AI is involved. But starting on the school side, a very basic school side mitigating measure may simply be to ensure we've got a good process in place and everyone's clear on what that process is for teacher or professional review of that AI's output to ensure that what's being fed back to students in that revision app example is of good quality and that it's accurate. But as I alluded to earlier, what about also a process in place to ensure that the initial upload of data to the revision platform is correct in the first place? For example, if there's any element of this where we can't use some form of API and actually it has to be done manually, are we going to have maybe a second member of school staff to review that, to give ourselves the assurance that we have done that? And we might need to look at restricting access on the school side to only staff who may have a legitimate reason for accessing the data. So yes, that's going to be class teachers, may well be in a secondary school, a form tutor or head of year, depending on how you work. But it's not likely for an example like this to be, for example, that you would require your catering staff to have access. That just wouldn't be necessary for a revision-based app. So make sure that you've got those restrictions in place within your organisation with the support, no doubt, from your IT. But as promised, we need to consider some of the measures that actually our AI provider, the processor, the company we're using, have got in place. And we need to ask them these questions and then add the information to our DPIA. So we need to get them to confirm things like this. We need to get them to confirm what are the margins of error in your model, so far as they're willing to share that, of course. But crucially, at the very best, at the very worst, I should say, we should be getting them to give an outline of the measures that they've got in place to minimise their margins of error, ensuring that quality and accuracy of the output. Again, we mentioned allocative and representational harm. Remember that risk of discriminatory outputs or of outputs being different on the basis of somebody being part of a particular group of people, a particular set of characteristics. How do they mitigate that risk? Only they can help us with that. Really importantly, we need to see as the school or trust, is there an option, if we're going to go ahead with this provider, to ensure that the personal data, that student personal data that we're putting in, is not going to be used to train the provider's large language model, or indeed the models of other AI companies that they rely on. Now, it's not always the case, but it's very often the case that a paid-for version of the product you're using should offer you the option, or may by default ensure that we do not train individuals' data, train the model on individuals' data. It's more likely if we are just using a publicly available version that we are going to be, if not, we're not paying in money, we're going to be paying in data, as I think we've all found out through the likes of social media in the past. AI providers very often work in the same way. Why is the training of people's data, of large language models on people's data potentially so detrimental? Well, it's an issue for the school from a data protection perspective if we can't mitigate that, because what lawful basis have we got? How can we lawfully and reasonably and fairly say, yeah, that's absolutely lawful and fair and right that, students' personal data, primary or secondary, is being used to train these companies' large language model? It is very, very unlikely to be justifiable. which is why we need to get that assurance in place from the provider we're using. And finally, at the bottom there, and this may apply to an example actually regardless of whether you're using AI or otherwise, but let's get them to give us an outline, the provider, of what sort of technical and security measures they have in place to manage that risk of a system security breach. Doesn't have to, but might well include something like certification to information management security standards, such as ISO 27001. Again, not a necessity, but an example of the kind of thing they might have in place. And then after having done all that consideration and all that consulting with the provider of the AI tool, let's get that down into the DPIA. So we're confirming what are the measures that we, the school, or they, the provider, have in place to reduce and mitigate risk. So you can see the examples we've got here. And thankfully, in our 3 examples here, you can see that, yes, these measures that either we or the provider have in place, they do significantly manage risk and reduce it down to what I think we consider, on balance, an acceptable level. And that's risk assessment. Over to Stacey.
Thanks, Adam. So there may be circumstances where we need to consult with the ICO. So that's when you've assessed your risk and you've mitigated risk. If they're still deemed to be a high level of risk to data subjects in any area, then we need to inform the ICO of that. But on the other hand, if we've assessed all the risk, we've mitigated all the risks and none of them are high, no residual risk is high, then we do not need to consult with the ICO. And subject to your DPO consultation with me and Adam and sign off from the school and trust, the project can then proceed from a data protection perspective. So just looking at the remaining steps of the DPIA now. So obviously the DPIA needs to be signed off and the outcomes recorded, and that includes our advice as DPO. Ultimately, it's the project sponsor or senior member of staff at the school or trust who will normally sign off on the DPIA and the agreed actions and the mitigating risks. Also, ensure that the DPIA doesn't just get completed and then put on a shelf, provided no use. So integrate the actions and outcomes that have been identified in that DPIA into your wider project plan for the initiative. And then again, not just leaving the DPIA to sit on a shelf, keep it under review. So both of the project progresses. So something might not turn out the way you thought it was going to do at the beginning. And also once you've gone live, if there's been any changes, and then ongoing after live, you know, if you need to update, if you need to provide further personal data than what was first specified, then keep that DPIA under review and send it to me and Adam as your DPO to review. So just looking at some takeaway actions that we want you to take away for your school or trust following this training. So really important is just get in touch with us, me or Adam, as early as possible if there's going to be a new project or initiative or a piece of work involving personal data. We can tell you straight off if you need a DPIA, or we might say, no, you don't need a DPIA. Particularly if AI is involved in processing personal data, you know, be prepared for that deeper dive risk assessment. And also you will need to go back to that supplier in respect of the AI elements of their product. And then, as Adam has mentioned previously, be aware that more often than not, free versions of AI products are likely to offer less required insurances on data protection. So particularly around the training of their large language models on student, staff and parent personal data. So if you're using a free version of AI, it's more likely than not it's training their large language models. And that's the end of our bite-sized training. Thank you for your time and for watching. Thank you.